I'm going to hand the mic, I'm going to mute everybody, and then I'm going to hand the mic over to Alan, who's going to introduce Rochy. And we thank Rochy immensely. She's coming to us from Brisbane, Australia, where it's 5:30 a.m. in the morning. And Alan, are you good to go?
This is her.
Okay, so mute all.
Just fine.
Hey.
Okay, Alan, you can take it away.
Okay, hello everybody. I just want to I have the pleasure today of introducing the presenter. Can everyone hear me okay?
We can hear you fine.
Excellent. I'm honored and delighted to present Dr. Rochy Leibowitz Miller, all the way from Brisbane. It's approximately 5:30 her time. But I suggested that she do a presentation of her new incredible book based on her mother's experience as a Holocaust survivor. And Rabbi Levertov agreed that it would be a great idea. She too, like myself, is also ex-South African. We went to medical school together. She and her husband immigrated, who also went to medical school with me, Jonathan. They immigrated toward Brisbane, Australia. I ended up here in the United States. And she and I and her husband have been friendly stayed in touch for at least 45 years or longer. Rochy is an amazing multi-dimensional individual, multi-talented, not only with a medical degree, but a gifted artist and a writer and an educator as well. So I'm delighted to present her. The book that she is going to be talking about is called Not Just a Survivor. It's available on Amazon. And now, without further ado, as Ed McMahon would say on The Tonight Show, here's Rochy.
Hi, Ellen. Thank you, everybody. Let me just get this PowerPoint working. Sorry, I'm just trying to get this technology to work. It was working a second ago. There we go. Share screen.
Share screen.
Okay.
We got you, thank you.
You got me, thanks. So, let me find where this is. So, good day from Australia, everybody. And thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. So, at this moment in time, you and I are on different continents, different countries. We're even on different days and in different time zones. And you may be wondering, why is this stranger from Australia here on our screens talking to us? And what on earth do we have in common? And I believe our commonality exceeds our differences. What we share is our Jewish history and our Jewish heritage. And we are here to share an experience that honors that heritage and ensures that our history is remembered. So I'm here to talk to you today about a remarkable woman, somebody whose normal life was totally decimated for the years between 22nd of June 1941, when she was incarcerated first in the KOVNO ghetto and then in 5 concentration camps in Estonia and Germany, until she was liberated on the 15th of April 1945 from Bergen-Belsen. But what I want to focus on today is not the horror of that time, nor the terrible devastation and loss that she suffered, but I want to focus on her bravery and her humanity and her optimism. And these are factors that helped her to survive, and they allowed her to emerge from that dark period as a whole, accomplished and exemplary human being. She was someone who went on to dedicate her life to perpetuating the memory of the Holocaust, to educating everyone she could, and to ensure the lessons of that time would never be forgotten. She was an incredible person who I was privileged to have as a mother. Let me tell you a little about me. My name is Rochy Miller. I was born in South Africa, and I emigrated to Australia in 1991, where I live with my husband. I have 2 married children, one of whom lives in Australia and the other lives in the USA and Florida with her husband and my 2 gorgeous granddaughters. I'm a retired medical doctor. I have a degree in journalism, and I've just published a book, as you heard, called Not Just a Survivor, A Portrait of My Mother, which is a memoir about my mother's life. Let me tell you a little bit about my mother. So my mother, Lea, was born in Lithuania. And from the outset, by all accounts, she was special. She was exceptionally smart. She studied at the University of KOVNO at a time when many women didn't complete high school. She had a degree in natural sciences, and she taught at a Hebrew high school. She was fluent in at least 7 languages, and she could communicate in many others. And she was learned, gregarious, and a loving family member. This is a family photo of my mother as a teenager with her parents and younger siblings. They lived in Malat, which was a small town in Lithuania where her parents had a bakery and a restaurant. She had an older brother who had immigrated to South Africa in 1926, and her 2 younger siblings. In 1937, she married Moses Klompus, and a year later they had a son, Michael. They lived a relatively normal family life in KOVNO, which was the capital of Lithuania. In 1940, Lithuania was invaded by Russia, and there was a non-aggression pact signed between Russia and Germany. And as a result of this document, the Lithuanian Jewry had a false sense of security, despite the impact that Germany was having in other parts of Europe. This continued, and then on the 22nd of June 1941, everything changed. Despite the non-aggression pact, Germany invaded Lithuania. And this is her quote, which says, "You can imagine, we were sitting peacefully on a Sunday, a sunny Sunday morning in June, because Russia and Germany have got a non-aggression pact and Lithuania is ruled by Russia. We think we are quite safe. But then we see at about 12 o'clock in the morning, German planes attacking KOVNO, which was the capital of Lithuania. Bombs were all the time just booming, and that is all we heard. And from that very minute, we could already not get out onto the streets because we were straight away arrested or taken away to be shot. And from this moment, all the Jews in Lithuania ceased to be normal members of the community where they had been born, where they had lived and worked and identified as citizens. Many of them were murdered by their Lithuanian neighbors and the German forces in the first few days of occupation. Those who survived this initial onslaught were forced into the ghetto, where every liberty was curtailed. Despite this, my mother and her husband and child and her mother-in-law remained in the ghetto as a family for 15 months, and they counted themselves lucky. They had work, they were together, Against all odds, they survived selections, hunger, and brutality. And then in October 1942, the Nazi authorities issued a demand for 2,000 men from the ghetto to be sent to Estonia. The Judenrat provided a list, and my mother's husband's name was on it. There was an offer for the men's families to go with them, and they said if they agreed, they were promised they could continue to live together. So after much agonizing, they all decided to go to Estonia together as a family. But it was a cruel Nazi hoax, and as soon as they reached the train station, the family was separated. My mother was sent to one concentration camp in Estonia, her husband was sent to another, and her not quite 5-year-old son and his grandmother were sent to Auschwitz, and my mother never saw them again. So my mom spent almost 3 years in 5 different concentration camps. These were Vivera, Erida, and Lagedi, which were all in Estonia. And then they transferred via Stutthof in Germany to a camp in Ochsenzoll, which was an offshoot of the infamous women's camp Ravensbrück, close to Hamburg. And finally, she was sent to Bergen-Belsen, where she was liberated on the 15th of April 1945. And she describes these details in this document that I found, which is entitled The Story of My Life. And it's dated 14th of February 1946, which was 10 months after liberation while she was working and living in Bergen-Belsen displaced persons camp. And for me, for my mother, who was such an accomplished person, to define herself in such minimalist terms was quite incredible. My mum explained to us that survival in the concentration camps was due mostly to chance. She estimated that this accounted for maybe 90% of survival, but the other 10%, what you did with the chance you were given, was up to you. And she influenced that 10% with her innate strengths. She used these skills to help others to survive as well. She was brave and she was not afraid to confront authority. And her ability to converse with her captors in their language gave her an advantage. The first concentration camp she was sent to was Vivera in Estonia. After the initial devastation of being separated from her family and the incredible dehumanization and humiliation that she endured, somehow her resilience emerged and she began to hone her amazing coping skills. She worked in the barracks, having to clean the squalid living quarters of 100 women who shared 20 bunks, and they were locked in overnight with no toilet facilities. Every morning, the capo would come to collect 60 or 70 of the women from the barracks for forced labor, and frequently he would beat them when they wouldn't comply. My mother couldn't stand the brutality, and she quickly devised a plan. She approached him and she offered to organize the work groups for him on condition that he would not assault the women. And then she got the women to agree to a roster system that she set up, enabling the very young and the very old not to go out to work and ensuring that the others took turns to have a day off. And it worked. There was a compliant workforce and the most vulnerable remained in the barracks and recuperated. And the German camp leader actually took note of her skills and she earned his grudging respect, which allowed her to have a little bargaining power. So step by step, she succeeded in taking some control of an untenable situation and making it a little better for everyone. She made sure that the women who remained in the barracks each day helped her with the cleaning. She managed to establish a relationship with the German kitchen staff, and this enabled her to access some coal and wood so that the barrack was a little bit warmer when the women came back from work. It was freezing conditions. and there was hot water to drink. Early on, my mother recognized the importance of connectedness. Instinctively, she knew that friendship and belonging helped to overcome the dehumanization that the Nazis sought to perpetrate. So during her time in the camps, she gathered around her a group of about 10 younger women who became her friends, and she talked of them as her girls or her adopted daughters. And they looked out for each other. They made sacrifices for each other, and they survived together. And this is a photograph of my mother and her adopted daughters taken at Bergen-Belsen 10 months after liberation. They all survived together. And this is her quote. "We were mostly from KOVNO, from Lithuania, our group. We were all the time like a whole group. We always were standing together, and this helped us a lot. We came from one place, so we had the same schooling. We had the Hebrew language, all of us. And whenever we had a chance, we were just sitting and telling each other stories. Stories about what we had studied or stories from home, trying not to forget who and what we are." This photo is an incredible gift that they made for her. It's a handmade book. Each page is a handwritten tribute to her, presented to her by her adopted daughters for her birthday on the 5th of July, 1945. The cover of the book, which is here, is made from a Canadian Air Force uniform, and the inside cover is adorned with pressed and fabric flowers. This is amazing evidence of the role that she played in their lives. So at this point, I want to tell you 3 short stories, 3 incidents that illustrate this incredible relationship. One of her girls was a teenager, and she was smaller and frailer than the others, and she struggled to make it through the 24 hours between one meager meal and the next one. And as the day wore on, she would faint from hunger. Now, any evidence of weakness was almost certain to lead to extermination. If her fainting was ever observed by a Blitzwoman or another Nazi official, she would almost certainly have been sent to Auschwitz. And my mother knew this, and so she devised a plan to save her. She gathered all the other girls in her group, and she arranged for each of them to retain a little of their daily ration of bread in order to give it to the girl during the day and stop her from fainting. Imagine the selflessness for someone who gets watery soup and 1/10 of a loaf of bread as their only sustenance each day to give some of it away. It was a huge sacrifice, but my mother asked it of them and they all complied. And because of this amazing generosity, this girl survived. The second story also illustrates the same incredible generosity. It occurred when they were transferred to Stutthof, which is a staging point before they were moved to a new concentration camp near Hamburg. They noticed a young girl from another camp who had been pulled aside and was waiting for transportation to extermination. And the group made a decision to try to save her. And my mum's description is this. She said, "So we, the KOVNO girls, got together. What were we going to do about it? We couldn't simply let her die." A Russian lady was in charge of watching the selected group of doomed inmates. She was looking after them until they were to be deported. We still had something hidden, a chain, a watch, some money, someone had a ring. So we decided to put together a parcel. I approached the Russian woman, I could speak Russian, and I told her what we would give her if she would take out this young girl for us. And she did. She brought me that little girl, and I paid with what we had for her. And we took the child back to the barrack where we were, and she became one of my girls. Her name was Chayela. She wasn't so little, she was 14, but she looked like 10. And until the end of the camps, she remained with me and she became my adopted daughter. The third story shows the reciprocal nature of their relationship. In this story, my mother's life was saved by the actions of her adopted daughters. After a short time in Vivera, my mother became ill with typhus, and she was sent to the so-called medical facility. This in itself was a miracle, since most inmates of the camps who became ill were simply sent to Auschwitz. But she'd earned the respect of the Nazi camp leader, and he ordered that she at least be given the opportunity to recover. There was no medical care, but there was a visit from a Jewish doctor and a nurse every day. And most people died in that facility, but my mother somehow recovered. Before she was well enough to leave the medical camp, however, the camp was closed to avoid the approaching Russian army, and the staff and occupants were ordered to move to a new camp, and the patients in the medical facility, including my mother, were wrapped in their blankets and thrown outside onto the snow and left to die. But her friends hadn't forgotten her, and at great personal risk, 2 of them came to find her. They brought clothes with them, they dressed her, and they carried her between them, dragging her to the place where the rest of the camp had been assembled. And they slipped her into the line with the healthy inmates, and they marched her to the train, and one of her friends, who was a nurse, pushed her into a train carriage and locked her in. And so, against all odds, thanks to their actions, she survived. Finally, on the 15th of April 1945, Bergen-Belsen was liberated by the Allied forces. And after liberation, my mother remained in Bergen-Belsen's displaced persons camp for almost a year. She worked first as a secretary to the commanding officer of Bergen-Belsen, and then she established a kosher kitchen for the Hungarian women. There were about 300 of them who remained in Bergen-Belsen who wanted a kosher kitchen. And there was relative security in the displaced persons camp. She was around her support network, but she needed to start her life again. She found the transition extremely difficult. I think only when the inmates were free did the true scope of their loss become real. She had lost everyone and everything. She'd lost her parents, her younger siblings, her husband, her child, her mother-in-law, her friends, her home, her possessions. But she never, ever lost the essence of who she was. And she retained her humanity and her morality throughout that time, and she survived. After 10 months in the displaced persons camp, my mother was ready to move forward. She had traveled to Europe for a short time looking for her husband, hoping against hope that he was alive, but she eventually had to accept that he had not survived. She looked at various options for her future. There was an illegal immigration to Israel that appealed to her sense of Zionism. She had some family in the United States who reached out to her, but she eventually decided to join her older brother in South Africa. At the time, South Africa was not accepting Holocaust survivors, but she had a cousin who was an influential lawyer there, and he managed to arrange a temporary visa for her. And she was the first survivor to arrive in South Africa. Shortly after arriving in South Africa, after an initial physical and mental breakdown where she spent 3 months in hospital, her resilience resurfaced. She enrolled in university, she got a job, and she rented an apartment. And she met my father, who she married in April 1948, 2 years after arriving in South Africa. She went back to university and she studied, and she got 4 more degrees over her lifetime, the last of which was a PhD in Holocaust literature at the age of 73. And she had 2 daughters, my sister and me. And in time, she had 5 adored grandchildren whose lives she influenced profoundly. She emigrated to Australia in 1990 and lived a full life in Sydney until she passed away in 2000 at the age of 86. Despite building a new life for herself, her fundamental identity was that of a survivor. She justified her survival and her determination to live by a self-imposed obligation to share her experiences with everyone. And this remained the central force in her life. After my mother passed away in 2000, I found in her apartment a remarkable collection of items, wonderful and important evidence of an incredible life. There were amazing documents from the time of her liberation. There were newspaper articles of her university achievements, photographs, writing, lecture notes, audio tapes, videotapes. She was an avid educator. She took every opportunity to talk about the Holocaust to whoever would listen. She gave countless interviews. She was a guide at the Holocaust Museum in South Africa and in Australia, and she was a living historian in numerous school programs. She immersed herself in Holocaust studies, trying to make logical sense of this inexplicable trauma. She truly embodied the Holocaust experience, physically, emotionally, and academically. My mother had always spoken openly about her experiences, and as her children, we were always aware of her loss and her sad past. We absorbed her experiences through all our senses into the core of our beings. Her past, our heritage, was always chillingly there. But it was only 5 years ago, 15 years after her death, when I began to really listen to the many interviews she had given over her life and read the documents that related not only to her Holocaust experience, but also to her active involvement in Holocaust education for the remainder of her life. And only then I truly appreciated how exceptional she was. I became awestruck by her resilience, by her incredible belief in what was important, and stunned by her sense of morality that dictated her decision-making and her tenacity to ensure that this dark chapter in history would never be rewritten by Holocaust denialists. As I worked through her writings and I listened to her words, the essence of my mother crystallized, and her mission to perpetuate the memory of those who couldn't tell their stories became my mission too. And so the book, The Story of My Mother's Amazing Life and Passion, was born. I guess by now you're starting to get a sense of the person my mother was. I could go on for hours telling you of her amazing attributes, of her bravery and her courage and her loyalty, and her coping skills and empathy, and her incredible sense of self, and her stubborn determination to live against all odds, always in the context of morality. I could tell you about her amazing pragmatism and her use of study as a therapy, and her enduring optimism. But I'm sure we have run out of time. So I will leave you simply with a statement that tells of the hero that I believe she was. She said, "Every hour of our life, to live an extra hour under those circumstances, this was courage, this was heroism. We couldn't do anything to our murderers, to our enemies, but at least we tried to defy them by trying to want to live." Thank you.
Rochy, thank you very much. Very, very inspiring. I'm going to open up to questions and answers. If you have any questions that you want to ask Rochy, please unmute your mic and you can go ahead and ask them. And I will unmute, Alan is unmuted, and he'll go ahead also and co-host the Q&A. Okay. Are there any questions?
Get out of this share screen. Hold on a sec. There you go.
Okay.
Yes, I had a question about did she talk at all about her child that passed and about her mother? Was this something that she just kept to herself? And how did she deal with that grief? Yeah, because, go ahead.
Yeah, no, she spoke very openly. We always knew that there had been a previous family. There was a photo of Michael on our mantelpiece. She observed your child always, and she was very, in fact, the book goes into a lot of detail on her family and on her connection to her mother, which is through cooking. And, you know, my mom was an amazing cook because her mom had been a baker. And so our connection to her home was through food.
Right.
And she was always very open, which is very different to a lot of Holocaust survivors who found it too difficult to speak about their past. But for her, it was the reason she existed was in order to tell everybody. And if she met you within 5 minutes, you would have known that she was a Holocaust survivor and, you know, and about the Holocaust.
Right. Yeah. And how can we get your book?
It's available on Amazon, and it's there as an ebook or a paperback. I can.
Okay.
Rochy, there's a question in the chat. Why? Rochy, there's a question in the chat.
Okay. It was my mum's older brother, not her son.
Okay. You have to go
He went to South Africa in 1929. His grandparents were actually living there. So my mum's grandparents emigrated to South Africa at the time of the gold rush, and he went to live there. I think there was this feeling in Lithuania at the time that, you know, things were not so good, and so many people emigrated.
Hello?
What year was that?
I think it was 1925 or something like that. So long before the war.
Long before. They might have been on the same boat that my Zeta was on, coming to South Africa.
Okay. And then there was a question here, Leibowitz, which is the publisher. I've self-published the book, so it's me. I have two names. I have a maiden name that was my medical name, and I have a married name, which is what I am now.
Okay.
I just want to say to Rochy, wow, what an incredible presentation. I had to hold back the tears through much of it. Incredibly powerful, magnificent. What a magnificent tribute to your mother. I've known Rochy, as I said, going back to medical school days in the 70s. And I'm reminded what a remarkable individual she is, what an incredible tribute this is to her mother. And I see this book and her presentation as just being worthy of doing at every level, to synagogues, to Jewish organizations, to schools, to keep the memory of what happened in the Holocaust alive, because sadly much of this is slipping as time goes on, and sadly new anti-Semitism is surfacing, and this topic to me is beyond important, crucial. Rochy, thank you for doing this magnificent. I tip my Red Sox cap to you. If I were wearing a yarmulke, I'd tip that to you as well. Thank you, Rochy.
Thanks, Alan. Thank you.
Janet, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I also am on the verge of tears, and thank you so much, and how fortunate for you to have the lovely memories of your amazing, amazing mother, and likewise, I'm sure that you have her genetics. There's no doubt about your strength and all that. And as you mentioned before, I was surprised because all of the children of Holocaust survivors that I have come in contact with cry out and say, my mom, my dad never spoke about it. never spoke about the Holocaust. They just repressed all of that. So this is quite amazing, and thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you. For me, I grew up with this, so it was automatic for me that my mum did talk. But I think there were two schools of people. There were people who wanted to pretend it never happened, or who didn't have the strength to actually bring it to the present, and they dealt with it by suppressing it and never speaking about it. And I think, there's probably 50% of people who were Holocaust survivors.
Somebody needs to mute themselves.
But, for me, my mum believed that she survived, and the reason she could justify her survival was to tell people about it so that they would never forget it. And that was just what we grew up with,
Alan.
Hi.
Yes. Hi. I guess when you talked about 50% of the survivors spoke and 50% didn't, it reminds me also, I know a lot of Holocaust survivors, and I would say 50% of them became religious after they survived because they credited God, I'm guessing, for the survival, including my parents. And 50% became totally unreligious because how could God allow this to happen? I'm just curious, was your mother religious after the Holocaust?
Okay. So my mother was both. Okay. She was observant and didn't believe in a God. And when I questioned this dichotomy, she couldn't reconcile that a God could have done this to her. But she was in shul every single Friday night, and she kept a kosher home. And when I said to her, who are you praying to? If you don't believe there is a God, who are you praying to in the synagogue every Friday night? And she said it was respect for her parents. So she was upholding the traditions as a respect to her parents. She was also a very educated lady. And so whenever there was a question in her life, she studied it. And so she went to all the shiurim, she went to all the religious discussions. She had many, many friends who were rabbis, and she drove them crazy, I think, because she argued and she asked and she learned it. And in the book, there is a little chapter about her feelings about Judaism. And in the end, she actually reconciled. Before she passed away, she got to the point where she did believe there was a God, and she was back to happiness in her head that, there was a God and somehow he had done this. But it was, sorry.
No, I'm sorry. No, I was just going to say, your presentation was outstanding. It was so well organized, and I could have listened to you for an hour and a half rather than a half an hour, and you just did a fantastic job. And I feel like I know your mother and I know her history. You really capsulized it really well. So I wanted to thank you.
I appreciate
May I jump in? I am the daughter of two Holocaust survivors from Poland, and it's been the bane of my life. I'm completely engulfed with the ramifications. I was thinking, with the anti-Semitism and those who are backing anti-Semitism, if you can conjecture what your mother would give advice at this point, or do you have, knowing your mother, knowing the history, do you have any advice what happens as this anti-Semitism is rampant?
I imagine that her answer would be to educate as many people as you can.
Educate what?
To avidly go out and tell people what did happen, and to engage as many people as possible. Because I think the people that you engage one-on-one, the closer you get to dissolving this myth that Jewish people are odd or strange or different, or we have a moral, we have two ways of looking at things. We have a group ideology. We see black people in this way, we see Jews in this way, But when you know them one-on-one, you have a different perspective.
Sure.
And so I guess she would have made it her mission to speak to as many people one-on-one as she could, putting herself out there that I'm a Jew, this is what I went through, this is my belief system. You know, one person at a time.
Well, they're trying to do, I don't know if you know the story, there's I think there's a football player who made these anti-Semitic tweets, and I forgot which Jewish agency grabbed hold of him, and they did some one-on-one. And then they invited him to come to Israel. And he was so excited because he always wanted to come to Israel. He ultimately apologized. So what you're saying is actually happening. My question is, the negative happening much more and much faster than a one-to-one?
I guess we can only do what we can do. You know, we can only change the world one person at a time, unless you're somebody extremely powerful at a government level. And even then, you know, you're talking to somebody's psyche, somebody who's had this ingrained in them forever. I have no magic.
So, Rochy, we grew up in South Africa.
Thank you. Thank you, by the way. Thank you.
We grew up in South Africa. And I have to say that your story of mother telling you, talking to you, is so opposite to what I had in my family. My family never spoke about it. We knew nothing. We knew nothing to the point of, were any other family members lost in the camps or whatever. Today, my sons are starting to ask me questions. Do I know, were there any brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, anything like that? And I after hearing your story, I'm lost. And I'm so sad that my parents and my grandparents never spoke to me, and of course my brother and sister, about it. It was a no-no. So you are very, very fortunate.
I feel very privileged. I feel privileged and I feel empowered, but I also feel obligated in a sense that having this available to me, I need to perpetuate it. It's a dual-edged sword. You know, I'm so lucky to have, and I have huge amount of information. Not only did she talk, but she left so much documentation. And because my mum had been such an active educator, I have audio tapes and videotapes of interviews. So there's a lot of information, but I have an obligation that I had to do something with it. I couldn't just sit on it, which I did for 15 years. I sat on it. But it's just, you know, I have to now put it out there.
I have one quick question to the host. Izzy, have we taped this Zoom session?
Yes.
Excellent. Because I think this is, I obviously want to share this with friends and family who really need to see this amazing PowerPoint and discussion that Rochy presented today. And if you can just send out the invitation, is it going to be on a YouTube, or how can we access it?
What happens is, when Levi gets back, he edits this video, and then he'll post it onto the Smile On Seniors Facebook page, and as well as the YouTube page for Smile On Seniors. So it takes a couple days for him to put it up. If you don't see it in the next, let's say by the end of the week, just drop Levi an email and he'll give you the link to it. In fact, all of our presentations that we've had on Zoom are on Facebook and on YouTube.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. I was suspected that. I just want to make sure that this is one that I don't want my family and friends to miss. It was just utterly wonderful. Thank you, Izzy. Thank you so much, Rochy.
Do we have any other questions for anybody? There was a question over here. what made you leave South Africa and go to Australia? You should ask us the question.
Yeah, all of us. My sister had already left for Australia a few years before. And my mother, who didn't want to live in another society that was crumbling around her, decided in her wisdom that if she went to Australia as well, it would force my hand. So she left a year before we did. And South Africa was a wonderful country to live in. It had many limitations, and it was getting to a point where I wasn't comfortable in my skin there. I didn't see a future for my children there, and there was an opportunity to go where my family was, and so we left. And as medical practitioners, despite what you might think, it's actually was really difficult to get into Australia. They gave doctors negative points on their points score, but we got there. Do you want to add, Izzy, why you left?
We left earlier than you. We left in 1980 to go to South Africa. Basically what it was, our family was in the diamond business in South Africa, and at the time it was myself, my father, and my grandfather running the business. And the only source of buying diamonds was De Beers. And what De Beers was doing is they were cutting back on the amount of caratage they would give us or sell to us and put the price up. So today, I don't feel sorry for them because their sales are down about 95%. So I actually don't care. Anyhow, my younger brother graduated from college, and he came into the factory, and I trained him in running the factory and what to do. But eventually what happened was there was not enough work for both of us. So in 1977, we did what all South Africans did. We came to America. And my wife and I and my brother and his wife came, and we toured around, and we did what everyone else did. Went to see a lawyer, got an application for a green card. And we were able to delay the application to 1980, to the beginning of 1980. And I said to my brother at the time, we didn't have any children. We had 3. I said, do you want to go or you don't want to go? And he said, no. I said, okay, goodbye. So we emigrated with the family to the States. We had the visa, we came to the States, and I started off a diamond business. My choices were to go to New York, Los Angeles, maybe Philadelphia and Chicago. So we decided I didn't want to live in the New York weather. So we came to Los Angeles, which in those days was still a growing market. And I was in the business in Los Angeles for 31 years when I got really tired of the way business was conducted. In my day, with my grandfather and my father, it was a handshake and a mazal. And today, that doesn't exist. It just got to me. So I left the diamond industry. I must say that it was a phenomenal move for my sons. They've done extremely well here in the States. I do not think they would have gotten as far had we stayed in South Africa. As you know, when you stay in South Africa and you're a white person, your family better own the business, otherwise you're not getting a job. So they are doing very well, and that's how we got to the States. We upped and we were blessed by my in-laws and my parents. They drove us straight to the airport and said, go. And that was it. So we came here for that.
Okay.
Anyhow. So you've got time to make breakfast now.
I have. It's 6:30, 6:20 a.m. on Thursday.
Okay.
Thank you so much, everybody, for giving me this opportunity. I really appreciate it.